Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Professor S.P. Singh from Faculty of Management Studies, Gurukul Kangdi University, Haridwar. Today we are going to study Module 29 on narratives. After you have finished this module, you shall be able to know the narrative interview and understand the episodic interview. The narrative interview contemplates a setting which inspires confidence and incites interviewees to relate a story about some significant occurrence in the informant's life. Narratives can be applied as a form of data as a course of action to semi-structured interviews. The basic doubt about how far subjective experiences may be made in the question-answer scheme of traditional interviews, even if this is handled in a flexible way, is the methodological starting point for the dissemination of using narratives. Narratives allow the researcher to approach the interviewee's experiential yet structured world in a big way. A narrative is characterized by the outlining of the initial situation, then the selection of events relevant to the narrative from the whole host of experiences and presented as a coherent progression of events, and finally the presentation of the situation at the end of the development. As a special method for collecting this form of data, the narrative interview is a particularly fine example of this kind of approach. Narratives as a method of knowledge and of presenting experiences are also increasingly analyzed in psychology. The narrative interview. In the context of biographical research, the narrative interview is primarily applied. A project on local power structures and decision processes were the contexts for the development of this method. Its basic principle of collecting data states that in the narrative interview, the informant is called for to tell the history of an area of interest in which the interviewee took part in a narrative without any preparation. The task of the interviewer is to make the informant present the story of the area of interest in question as a consistent story of all relevant events from the beginning to the end. Elements of the narrative interview. There are elements of narrative interview including generative narrative question, narrative probing, questioning stage, and balancing stage. The narrative interview begins using a generative narrative question referring to the topic of the study and intending to stimulate the interviewee's main narrative. The stage of narrative probing, in which narrative fragments that were not exhaustively detailed before are completed. The final stage of the interview is the balancing phase. In this phase, the interviewee may also be called for questions aiming at theoretical accounts of the occurrence and at balancing the story, curtailing the meaning of the entire to its general denominator. It is important to verify if the generative question really is a narrative question. The questions should not be asked in this part or interrupt with directive interventions or evaluations. The interviewer should play an active listener giving indication that he empathizes with the narrated story and the perspective of the narrator. This will provide support and encouragement to the interviewees to continue their narratives till the end. The end of the story is indicated by a coda, that is pretty well. It, by and large, I hope that has meant something to you. In the questioning period, the story's fragments that have not been detailed are addressed again, or the interviewer, with another generative narrative question, addresses those passages that had been unclear. In the balancing phase, more and more abstract questions are asked which aim for description and argumentation. Problems in conducting the narrative interview. An important problem in conducting the narrative interview is the systematic breach of interviewers and the interviewees' role expectations concerning the situation of an interview. Because questions in the usual sense of the word are not put up. An interviewee's narrative of everyday life is seldom given. The violations of situational expectations often generate irritations in the two parties, which hinder them from coming amicably to the interview situation. Although the ability to narrate may be a day-to-day competence, but the control varies in degrees. Therefore, it is not always the most suitable method of social science. All interviewees are not capable of making narrative presentation of their lives. Unsocial, shy, uncommunicative, or excessively reserved people are met in everyday social life as well as in biographical interviews. Applying this method in foreign cultures also faces certain problems. The primary orientation. The primary orientation is to provide the interviewees with the scope to tell their story and to require them to do so. Intervention. Concrete, structuring, or thematically deepening interventions in the interview are postponed until its final part, in which the interviewer may take up topics broached before and asked more direct questions. The restriction of the structuring role of the interviewer to the end of the interview and to the beginning is linked to this. Contribution to the general methodological discussion. The narrative interview and its attached methodology highlight a qualitative interview's making of the responsive structure and experiences. A model that reconstructs the internal logic of processes stresses the narrative as a gestalt loaded with more than statements and reported facts. This also provides a solution to the dilemma of the semi-structured interview. This solution includes three elements: method fit into the research process, the theoretical background of studies applying narrative interviews is chiefly the analysis of subjective views and activities, though it depends upon the method used for interpretation. Research questions chased from this perspective concentrate on biographical processes against the background and in the context of concrete and general circumstances. The procedure is mainly suitable for developing grounded theories. A gradual sampling strategy in accordance with the theoretical sampling appears to be most helpful. special suggestions for the interpretation of narrative data collected applying this method. Using this method, the goal of the analysis is usually to develop types of biographical courses as an intermediary phase in the direction of theory building. Limitations of the method. The assumption that the narrative interviews allow the researcher to have access to factual experiences and events poses a problem connected to it. This assumption is stated in placing narrative and experience in a corresponding relationship. However, narrative presentation is constructed in a specific form in the process of narrating the situation in which they are told may influence the memories of previous events. There are problems relating to the validity of the data connected to the narrative interview. Further, it is essential to critically ask a question prior to using this method. Using this kind of a strategy for drawing out biographical information raises questions of ethics in research. The episodic interview. The starting for the episodic interview is the assumption that subjects' experiences of a specific domain are accumulated and remembered in forms of narrative, episodic, and semantic knowledge. Whereas episodic knowledge is affiliated to experiences and connected to actual situations and circumstances, semantic knowledge is supported by assumptions and relations, which are abstracted from these and generalized. In the former case, the course of the situation in its context is the main unit around which knowledge is arranged. In the latter case, concepts and their relation to each other are the central units. To access both forms of knowledge about a domain, Flick designed a method to collect and analyze narrative episodic knowledge using narratives, while semantic knowledge is made accessible by actually pointed questions. But the episodic interview is not an attempt to artificially cause to conform to experiences. Rather, it begins from episodic situational forms of knowledge based on experience. A distinct attention is paid in the interview to situations or episodes in which the interviewee has had experiences that appear to be pertinent to the question of the study. In several domains, the episodic interview makes easier the presentation of experiences in a general comparative shape, and simultaneously it ensures that those situations and episodes are told in the state of their being specific. Therefore, it consists of a combination of narratives inclined to situational or episodic contexts and argumentation that strip such contexts in favor of conceptual and rule-oriented knowledge. The interviewee's narrative competence is used without forcing the interviewee to finish a narrative against his or her intentions. Elements of episodic interview. There are three main elements of an episodic interview, including repeated questioning, an interview guide, and interviewee's imagination. Repeated question. The chief element of the episodic interview is that the researcher repeatedly asks the interviewee to present narratives of situations. Interview guide. The researcher equips himself with an interview guide to provide direct to the interview to the topical domains for which such a narrative is needed. In order to familiarize the interviewee with this form of interview, its basic principle is first explained. Interviewee's imagination. The interviewee imagine of expected or apprehended changes forms another aspect of this interview. These narratives, motivating influences are supported by questions in which the interviewees are asked subjective definitions. Also, abstractive relations will also be. This is the second large composite of questions directed at approaching semantic parts of knowledge in everyday life. Problems in conducting the episodic interview. The general problem of interviews generating narrative is also a problem with the episodic interview. The problem of how to mediate the principle of recounting certain situations to the interviewee has to be handled carefully in order to prevent certain experienced situations from being mentioned but not recounted. As in other forms of interviews, it is an essential precondition that the interviewer has really internalized the principle of the interview. Flick suggested careful interview training using actual examples should focus on the way to handle the interview guide and the way to stimulate narratives and probing if necessary. In episodic interviews, the researcher employs the benefits of both the narrative interview and the semi-structured interview. These narratives apply the interviewee's adequacy to furnish experiences in their course and context as narratives, episodes as an object of such narratives, and as an approach to the experiences relevant for the subject under study, permit a comparative actual approach that does the narrative of the life history. In contrast to the narrative interview, this procedure analyzes routines and normal everyday phenomena. For a topic like technological change, these routines may be as instructive as the particulars of the interviewee's history with technology. In the episodic interview, the range of experiences is not restricted to those parts that can be furnished in a narrative. As the interviewer, the researcher has more options to intervene and direct it through a series of key questions relating to a subject, recounting and defining situations. Thus, the extremely one-sided and artificial situation of the narrative interview in episodic interview, a more open dialogue in which narratives are used as only one form of data replaces it. By connecting narratives and question-answer sequences, this method realizes the triangulation of different approaches as the basis of data collection. Limitations of the method. The narrative interviews are restricted in their application to the analysis of everyday knowledge of certain objects and topics and interviewee's own experiences with them. Similar to other interviews, they provide access neither to activities nor to interactions. However, these can be reconstructed from the participants' viewpoints and group-specific differences in such experiences. Friends, in this module, you have studied the narrative interview and the episodic interview. Thanks for visiting EPG Pathshala.